Hello there, welcome, and thank you for being here on this episode of From a Place of Self. So glad that you are here with me. Appreciate you taking this journey. I wanted to talk a little bit today about the nature of self and its relationship to our experiences of trauma. Light topic for today. The reason I want to talk about self is because it is such a foundational principle of the IFS model. In his book, No Bad Parts, Dick Schwartz talks about how his discovery of self, and when he says discovery, not invention, but his stumbling upon the idea or the phenomenon of self, that we all have an innate core sense of being, our seat of awareness, that all religious and spiritual traditions have some awareness of, whether it's the Atman or Brahman or Buddha nature or our soul, right? Our very essential being. And the reason why I want to relate that to trauma is that self is ultimately the healing agent. Peter Levine talks about the idea of trauma being something that develops in the lack of a witnessing of our painful experience. There was a recent clip I saw with Gabor Mate and Mel Robbins, where Mel Robbins was talking about a traumatic experience in her own life that took place when she was a younger girl. And Gabor Mate asked her the question, who did you talk to when it happened? And she said, nobody. And he said, that was your trauma. Not as much of the event itself, but your aloneness in it. And therefore the trauma began much earlier than even the event itself. And he began to parallel her own experience with her own daughter. I said, if you had a daughter and this same type of traumatic event happened, what would you want her to do? And she said, I'd want her to tell me and talk to me about it. And he said, what would it mean that if she didn't want to talk to you? And he said, well, it means that she wouldn't feel safe. For some reason, she doesn't feel safe. She doesn't feel comfortable talking to me, and that would break my heart. And Gabor said, exactly. That's what you felt. Not only did this horrible thing happen to you, but you didn't feel safe enough to talk to anybody about it. Why didn't you feel safe enough to talk to anybody about it? Why didn't you feel safe enough to talk to your parents or to talk to some caretaker or caregiver? So there was already, before the event took place, an isolation of self. And when we're kids, we don't have the cognitive abilities or mental or physical faculties in order to access ourself in the way that we need to regularly. And therefore, we begin this process of the denial of ourself, and we begin to push self out of the system, and younger, vulnerable, wounded parts begin to lead the way. And Nicole LePera, the holistic psychologist, writes in her book, How to Do the Work, which I'd like to share for you this excerpt about trauma, where trauma isn't necessarily the event of what took place or the severity of what took place. There's overt trauma, which is a direct experience of physical or sexual abuse or assault or a life-threatening accident or something severe that takes place at a point in time that we all collectively, societally agree that that was severe. But trauma is not the event. Trauma is the experience of danger, being in a dangerous situation or being in a perceived situation of danger, which has the same internal effect, and being overwhelmed by it to such an extent that we're not able to bring ourselves back to a place of stability and safety. So there's an event or a series of events that are dangerous or feel dangerous, right? Sometimes when we're kids, something can feel very scary, regardless of whether we're in any genuine danger or not, but that doesn't matter. If we feel threatened, it's the same internal experience as being actually threatened. So that's why horror movies and roller coasters give us such a thrill, right? There's no danger in watching a horror movie or going on a roller coaster, but you feel the same thing. So being in a situation of danger and being so overwhelmed by it that it floods your system and you're unable to reconsolidate yourself back to a place of safety. And that feeling stays with you to the extent where you're continuously reliving that experience and your body mind system has lost its ability to recognize that the event is over and you're no longer in that situation of danger and you're constantly reliving from that place of danger. It's a loop. It's a being stuck in the past. And it can be a specific event or it can be ongoing chronic events that we might not normally collectively agree is traumatic. It can be ongoing neglect or bullying or racism or rejection or betrayal or denial over the course of time, where our nervous system is in a continuous state of stress, feeling unsafe, and our body, like a rubber band that's been stretched too many times, loses its ability to reconsolidate back to a normal state of being and safety. So, in the result of that, we develop various coping strategies, often maladaptive coping strategies. Cue drugs, alcohol, sex, overachieving, shopping, binge watching, what we might call mental health disorders, anxiety, depression, ADHD. I love listening to Gabor Mate or Richard Schwartz. I listen to Embracing All of You, which is dialogue between Gabor Mate and Richard Schwartz, both talking about ADHD, not as a diagnosis, but as a symptom of somebody who doesn't feel safe being still. And parts of ourselves develop a strategy of always moving, being distracted. Why do I feel unsafe being present, right? Is a question he would ask people, or Dick Schwartz would ask the parts of them that are exhibiting that behavior. So we develop various maladaptive coping strategies because the present moment still feels unsafe. And so what are addictive tendencies? Anything that takes me out of the present moment. The opposite of addiction is connection. And I want to be anything other than connected to the present moment. When I'm feeling the flames of this overwhelming pain or danger that I experienced previously. So Nicole LePera says, the cycle of unresolved trauma, right? So there was the dangerous situation that has not been resolved. I have not brought myself to a feeling of safety. And so many of us experience that, right? We don't know why. There's this gnawing thing inside of us, this feeling of just not being safe in my own body or mind, feeling empty, incomplete, feeling like I need to go somewhere, do something else. And then the repetition of maladaptive coping behaviors and consistent denial of, here's our word for today, self with a capital S, allows the pain to live on in our mind and body, where it can eventually make us sick. And there's a whole study of research that maybe we'll talk about in a future episode about how trauma relates to physical experiences in the body, specifically physical illnesses that we normally might think of as a diagnosis. I have some disease, it's in my body and in my blood, when in reality it might just be my body saying no on my behalf. It might be my body responding to the unresolved energy that's been buzzing in my system perpetually to the point of creating a burnout. And so specifically, this trauma being a consistent denial of self is what I wanted to focus on and have us take away from today, is that when we bring spirituality into our healing process, we're able to connect with our own self energy, which is connected to a greater field of collective self energy, of source, God, higher power, however we may refer to that. And we can become the compassionate witness to our trauma in a way that we've been trying to get the world to do for us. And therefore, being able to honor and recognize our own self and find ways to connect to ourself through meditation, through kirtan, through spiritual study, through time in nature, through breath and mindfulness, whatever it may be. That's why meditation can feel so powerful, because it simply allows the overactive protective parts of ourselves to relax a little bit enough that our self energy can just come forward. And we don't have to bring in anything extra to do that. We just need to calm things down enough that we can experience something that's already inside of us. And that's why meditation can also be frustrating and scary because if those overactive parts of us don't relax, then we're just left with the pain, or we're left with the anxiety, or we're left with the depression, or the worry, or the doubt, or the fear. And so that's why so many cognitive general approaches towards trauma recovery or healing fall short. Because if we're just talking about it and identifying it without relating to it from a compassionate place of authentic spiritual self, then we're just rewounding, we're rehashing, we're just spinning the cycle, the wheel round and round. But when we're able to compassionately witness and come back to a place of safety internally, then we can authentically relate to our past in a way that brings us into the present and provides self-leadership and compassion that facilitates healing to take place. So my invitation for you today and for this week is to do some exploration about what your relationship to your core sense of self is. Generally, most likely, if we're stuck in trauma states, we don't have a strong connection to our sense of self. We may not even know what that means. We may not even be aware that we have a self, which is all the more reason for us to take the time to do some open exploration through journaling, meditation, inquiry, conversation with friends, whatever it may look like, and just hypothetically allow yourself to open up to the idea that yes, I have a core sense of self, which is beyond my wounding, beyond my traumas, which is separate from my anxiety, my depression, my worry, my doubt, my fear, my pain, my shame, my guilt, my extreme beliefs. And what are the simple ways in which I can allow myself to just come in contact, even for a moment, with that spiritual energy today? And if we just allow ourselves daily a way to connect to that spiritual energy through prayer, meditation, time in nature, reflection, journaling, whatever it may be, then we can allow ourselves small experiences of reconnection that gradually build trust over time with those wounded parts of ourselves. And if we trust our internal system, and rather than denying and shutting up parts of ourselves, but learn to listen and get curious, like treasure hunters looking for wisdom and pearls of information that will guide us home, then we can restore balance into our system, and we can experience a wholeness which was there prior to any of the wounding in the first place, and which awaits us whenever we are ready to return. So I'm sending you lots of love. I'm so grateful that you're here listening. I know none of this is not always necessarily easy, but my hope is that in sharing these messages, we can find a little bit of hope and reconnection to remember that we're not alone, that healing is possible, and there are ways for us to reconnect to ourselves if we're ready to take the journey. Sending lots of love. Take care. Bye-bye.